In the history of modern retail, few images are as haunting or confusing as the interior of a Canadian Target store in the winter of 2014. Millions of excited Canadians walked into these massive, gleaming red boxes in Toronto, Calgary, or Vancouver and found themselves in what looked like a simulation running out of memory. The lighting was perfect, bright, and inviting. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the red bullseyes hanging from the ceiling. The marketing posters promised the kind of cheap chic abundance that had made the brand a cultural icon in America. Yet, looking at the shelves, the illusion shattered immediately. These aisles looked like they'd been looted during a civil unrest event. Entire sections of the store stood completely barren. Shoppers stared at 60-foot runs of pristine metal shelving occupied by nothing but a single lonely box of crackers. It was eerie. And for the Canadian public, who had spent years waiting for this moment, it was deeply insulting. Canadians had spent decades crossing the border to shop at Target in the United States, so they knew exactly what the brand was supposed to be. It was a magical place where you went in for toothpaste and came out with a patio set, 3 designer dresses, and a sense of spiritual fulfillment. It was the one brand that had successfully convinced the middle class that buying discount goods was a stylistic choice rather than a compromise. So, when Target announced they were coming to Canada, the public treated it like the arrival of the Beatles.
Here at home, there's a change tonight in the Canadian retail landscape that's capturing a lot of people's attention. The first of more than 100 Target stores opened in Canada.
However, less than 2 years after cutting the ribbon on their first store, Target Canada imploded. On January 15th, 2015, the company filed for CCAA protection, the Canadian equivalent of bankruptcy, announcing the closure of all 133 stores, the firing of 17,600 people, and a total write-off of roughly $7 billion. It's widely considered one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of retail expansion. To understand how a company burns through $7 billion in just 24 months, we need to rewind to the late 2000s, early 2010s. Back then, Target Corporation was an unstoppable juggernaut generating over $60 billion a year under the command of CEO Greg Steinhafel. Steinhafel was a true believer, a Target lifer who had spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder and viewed the red bullseye with almost religious intensity. However, despite the massive revenue, he was facing a serious problem at home. The American market was completely saturated with a store on practically every corner, and shareholders were getting restless for a new growth story. He turned his gaze north to Canada, which looked tantalizing. The data proved that Canadians were already obsessed with the brand, frequently crossing the border in massive numbers just to shop. This emboldened Steinhafel to reject the safety of a slow, methodical rollout where you open a handful of stores to test the waters. He decided for an immediate, full-scale invasion. In January 2011, he made a move that stunned the retail world. He paid nearly $2 billion to acquire the leasehold interests of Zellers.
There's a bullseye on Canada's retail landscape. American super chain Target has purchased 220 Zellers stores. About 150 of them will be converted to Target stores by 2014.
For those not familiar with the Canadian retail environment, Zellers was a discount chain owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. By 2011, Zellers stores were run down, dirty, and chaotic. It was the place you shopped only if you had absolutely no other option. But Target didn't want the business. They just wanted the buildings and the leases. In one signature, Target acquired more than 200 locations across the country. They instantly had a footprint that rivaled Walmart, a company that had spent nearly 2 decades building its Canadian presence in what looked like the deal of the century. In reality, Target got nothing but empty concrete shells. And worse, they were Zellers shells. These weren't the standardized, purpose-built warehouses that Target was used to in the US. These were weird stores. Some were in old malls with low ceilings, others were 2 stories high, while some were shaped like jagged puzzle pieces because they'd been added onto over 40 years. Target had to renovate. They budgeted $10 million per store just to get them up to code. But since Target had acquired leases, they were immediately on the hook as legal tenants, meaning they were now paying millions of dollars a month in rent on 133 empty buildings that were generating absolutely zero revenue. The clock started ticking the second the ink was dry, and the financial pressure was immense. Realizing they couldn't afford to let these assets sit idle, Greg Steinhafel and the board decided they needed to get the doors open and cash flowing immediately, setting an aggressive 2013 launch. This meant that they had roughly 2 years to renovate over 100 stores, hire 20,000 people, build 3 massive distribution centers from scratch, source tens of thousands of products, and set up a completely new supply chain. Typically, when a retailer enters a new country, they open 5 to 10 stores in the first year. They then work out the kinks, figure out the local laws, and stabilize the supply chain. Target was attempting to do 20 years of work in 24 months. The executive appointed to lead this massive undertaking was Tony Fisher, a 38-year-old rising star who was charismatic, smart, and adored by his team, yet notably inexperienced in international expansion. He was also operating within the constraints of Target's famous culture, an environment where stating "this is impossible" was viewed as a personal weakness. Instead of pushing back against the unrealistic deadline, the Canadian team convinced themselves they could simply brute force their way through. Another thing we need to talk about is that Target runs on a legacy system. It's a custom-built proprietary inventory management system that they've been tweaking and refining since the 1970s. It's old, clunky code, but it's bulletproof. It handles high volume perfectly because it was built by Target for Target. But when the planning team looked at bringing this system to Canada, they hit a wall. The US system wasn't built to handle Canadian currency. It wasn't built to handle the French language, which is a legal requirement for doing business in Quebec. It wasn't built to handle the complexities of Canadian sales tax. The IT experts told the executives that modifying the US system would take years. So they swung to the opposite extreme. Instead of adapting the old system, they decided to purchase a brand new, off-the-shelf solution called SAP. For those outside the corporate world, SAP is the industrial-grade operating system of the global economy. It's a German-engineered juggernaut that serves as the gold standard for enterprise resource planning, running the back-end operations of the largest companies on Earth. However, it's also a notoriously complex beast that demands absolute perfection from its users. Implementing SAP in a massive retail network is widely considered one of the hardest tasks in corporate IT, typically requiring 3 to 5 years of rigorous testing, configuration, and staff training to get right. Target's aggressive opening target of 2013, no pun intended, gave the IT team roughly 2 years. To make matters worse, they attempted to integrate it with 2 other massive platforms, JDA for merchandising and Manhattan for warehouse management. They were effectively trying to build a new central nervous system from scratch, forcing 3 complex systems to speak to each other for the first time, all while the countdown clock to the grand opening was ticking loudly in the background. But the real disaster was the data entry. Software is like a blender. It doesn't care what you put in it. If you put in fruit, you get a smoothie. If you put in rocks, you get a broken blender. To make SAP work, you need to input master data. You have to create a digital profile for every single item you sell. A tube of toothpaste, for example. The system needs to know the product ID, the vendor, the cost, the selling price, and crucially, the dimensions. This last part, dimensions, is where the nightmare began. Target faced the monumental task of manually inputting data for roughly 75,000 distinct products from scratch, as they had no existing Canadian database to rely on. To perform this mission-critical task, one might expect them to hire seasoned data architect or logistics veterans. Instead, they handed the keys to the kingdom to merchandising assistants, entry-level employees and recent uni graduates who were just excited to work for a cool brand. These young hires were packed into a room at the Mississauga headquarters and subjected to a grueling deadline, forcing them to manually enter thousands of lines of data while working 12 to 14-hour days under extreme pressure. And the system had no safety valve. The SAP system required dimensions to be entered in a specific format, but the vendors, the companies selling the soap and the towels, often sent their data in different formats. Some vendors sent dimensions in inches, some in centimeters, some sent the dimensions of the individual item, and some sent the dimensions of the case the items came in. The tired, stressed out data entry clerks would often just type in the numbers without checking the unit of measure. This led to the master data being filled with inaccurate data, and as a result, it started to hallucinate. The system uses these dimensions to calculate how to fill a truck and how to fill a shelf. If the system thinks the products are tiny, it orders thousands of them. It tells the warehouse, "We have plenty of room, send more." But when the trucks arrived at the distribution centers, the products were huge and the warehouses physically ran out of space. Inside the distribution centers, this data failure manifested in loading docks becoming dangerously overcrowded and pallets stacked in the aisles. The situation grew so desperate that merchandise began spilling out of the bay doors, forcing the company to rent off-site storage facilities just to house the overflow. This created a ludicrous scenario where Target was paying premium rates to store massive amounts of inventory that they couldn't locate, couldn't move, and ultimately couldn't sell. Meanwhile, the opposite was happening in the stores. Products weren't arriving in high enough quantities to fill the shelves because the computer believed they were actually already at capacity. You might be wondering how a disaster of this magnitude went unnoticed by the people in charge. Well, the answer lies in a toxic mutation of Target's corporate culture of Minnesota Nice. This philosophy meant being polite, collaborative, and upbeat. But in the high pressure cooker of the Canadian launch, it warped into a culture of passive-aggressive silence where optimism was mandatory and reality was optional. The epicenter of this dysfunction was a room full of young business analysts in Mississauga. Their careers depended on a single metric: in-stock percentage. If the computer showed that items were missing from shelves, their dashboard flashed an angry red, signaling failure. So, driven by self-preservation, these analysts found a way to cheat. They discovered a loophole in the software. If they simply turned off the automatic ordering switch for a specific product, the system stopped checking if it was in stock. The red warning light disappeared, replaced by a compliant green one. It was the corporate equivalent of unplugging a smoke detector to stop the beeping while their house burns down. By flipping these switches, the analysts saved their bonuses, but they effectively blinded the company. The computer stopped ordering new stock because it was told to ignore the empty shelves. The result was a total hallucination. At headquarters, executives were high-fiving over reports showing 90% in-stock rates, believing the launch was a triumph. Meanwhile, in the actual stores, the shelves were empty. The employees were effectively gaslighting their own leadership to survive. While the back end was burning, the front end, the customer experience, was facing its own crisis. Canadians are generally pretty sophisticated shoppers. Because a majority of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the US border, they know exactly what things cost in America. Now, economically, Target Canada had to charge more. Minimum wage is higher in Canada, taxes are higher, transportation costs are higher, and import tariffs are real. Walmart Canada is also more expensive than Walmart US. That's just the reality of the border. But Target had made a fatal mistake in their marketing. They'd hyped the brand as expect more, pay less. Canadians interpreted pay less as pay US prices. Target never corrected this assumption and even let the hype build. When the doors finally opened, the sticker shock was visceral, creating an immediate sense of betrayal among customers who felt like they were being price gouged simply for being Canadian. This disappointment was compounded by a selection that felt hollow. Thanks to the supply chain disaster, the shelves lacked the exclusive designer collaborations that gave the US stores their cool factor, resulting in a generic shopping experience that felt less like a retail revolution and more like the old Zellers with a fresh coat of red paint. To make matters worse, their competitors in the Canadian market had spent the 2 years prior to Target's arrival preparing for war. Walmart lowered prices aggressively, Canadian Tire revamped their stores, focusing on their heritage and loyalty program, and Costco continued to dominate the suburban bulk buy market. Target walked into a market that was already saturated with excellent retailers, and they walked in with a broken supply chain and higher prices. By the time the holiday season of 2013 arrived, Target Canada's first and most critical Christmas, the disaster was undeniable. During the busiest shopping weeks of the year, shelves sat empty, leading to a staggering loss of nearly $1 billion in just the first year of the operation. In the fallout, Tony Fisher was fired and replaced by Mark Schindel, a seasoned US executive brought in to stabilize this sinking ship. Slowly and painfully, they began to address all the glaring issues like the shelves being empty and the software being a mess. However, the operational fix came too late to save the business. Retail is built on habit, and once you break a customer's trust, forcing them to walk into a store 3 times only to find nothing, they stop coming back. Despite the improved inventory, foot traffic had already collapsed, and the once beloved brand had become toxic in the eyes of Canadian consumers. Back in Minneapolis, Greg Steinhafel, the architect of this disaster, was forced out and replaced by Brian Cornell, an outsider who possessed none of the emotional attachment to the Canadian project that his predecessor did. Cornell flew to Mississauga for a personal tour, and while he acknowledged the operational improvements and the finally stocked shelves, he couldn't ignore the most glaring metric of all. The aisles were empty. He demanded a realistic projection from his finance team, and the answer was brutal. Saving Target Canada would require an additional $2 billion in investment, and even with that cash injection, the division wouldn't turn a single dollar of profit until 2021, guaranteeing 6 more years of financial bleeding. Cornell realized that the Canadian division was dragging down the stock price and distracting leadership from the core US business, so he decided to call it quits. On the morning of January 15th, 2015, employees at headquarters were called into an emergency meeting and told the hard truth. Target was filing for bankruptcy protection.
We came in and we noticed one of our team leaders was reading his emails, and one of them had come from the board of directors, essentially confirming that Target Canada will be closing its stores.
All 133 stores would close, and all 17,600 jobs were gone. The announcement was devastating, but the way the news spread was even worse.
Target CEO announced today that it will close all 133 stores in Canada.
Cue that song from the South Park movie, but Target will no longer be able to blame Canada.
Most store employees found out by checking Twitter or seeing the news on the break room TV. They were watching a scrolling ticker announce they were fired while they were still in the middle of stocking shelves. Almost overnight, everything must go signs went up and inventory was sold off for pennies on the dollar. Target wanted out immediately, regardless of the mess they left behind. Creditors were left with nothing. Small Canadian suppliers, family businesses that had expanded just to serve Target, were left holding millions of dollars in unpaid bills. The fallout hit everyone. Landlords were suddenly stuck with 133 empty buildings again, facing a vacancy crisis that would take years to fix. Even the fight for employee severance pay dragged on, leaving a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. Target had spent 4 years planning the invasion, 2 years fighting the war, and just 3 months running away. Today, if you drive through the suburbs of Toronto or Montreal, you can still see the ghosts of the invasion. Some of those buildings are still empty, some were carved up into gyms or call centers, and some were taken back by Walmart or Canadian Tire. Target retreated to the safety of the US market. They fixed their home business, invested in digital, and today they're doing fine. Brian Cornell is hailed as a hero for having the courage to cut off the infected limb to save the body. Target Canada is now taught in business schools around the world, a gold standard of what not to do. It teaches us that brand equity isn't a magic wand. It teaches us that culture can be a liability if it silences the truth. And most of all, it teaches us that the boring stuff like the data entry, the dimensions of a box, and the supply chain code are actually super important. You can have the best marketing in the world, the most beloved logo, but if your computer thinks a patio chair is the size of a toothbrush, you're doomed. But what do you think? Do you remember the empty shelves? Did you manage to snag a deal at the liquidation sale? Or did you just walk away confused? And do you think Target could ever come back, or is that bridge burned forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.